Hello, I want to welcome you to this webinar. We're going to talk today about understanding male sexual trauma. My name is Jim Struve, and I have been involved with working with male survivors for about 41 years, so we'll try to lend some information and clarification of the issue today. I want to welcome you here, and I assume that some of you who will be watching this work in a variety of settings. Hope that this kind of general brief overview will be of relevance to a lot of you. My experience is I have worked in agency settings, having worked with Child Protective Services for a number of years. I've worked in residential, in hospital settings, and in private practice. I also do retreats for male survivors, so hopefully what I have to share and say today will be broad-based and can be applied as you have occasion in your settings. I'd like to start just really briefly with an overview of some statistics and definitions to help give a framework for this issue. Here is a list of some things that are kind of representative of what you may encounter for males who've experienced sexual trauma. One thing you'll probably note from this list is that it's somewhat similar to what you would encounter just as if you were working with females. There are a lot of issues that are generic, not gender specific, so that's the first thing that will be important to remember. A couple of things about male sexual trauma that's important is a lot of sexual abuse, sexual trauma for males occurs in institutional settings. There's the element of institutional betrayal. And what I mean by that is scouts, athletic functions, church, camps, things of that sort. And a place where we assume that our children are safe, but they are also very high risk for the sexual trauma that may happen. And there's also a number of things that are more covert about trauma for males. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on through the presentation. So how many men have been abused? We have been shifting over the course of years on this issue. Currently, what the research seems to show is that at least one of every 6 males is sexually abused before the age of 16. A lot of the research is trending to the amount of sexual trauma for males is equivalent as for females. Some of the difference in the statistics seems to be on reporting, not incidents. And a lot of the statistics have changed over recent years, not because male sexual trauma is becoming more prevalent, but because the reporting is becoming more accurate and more available. What surprised a lot of people is that adult males are also frequently victims of sexual trauma. Currently, for the National Crime Victimization Survey, they've identified a rate of about 38% of the incidents of rape were against males. Just translating to put this in human terms, here's a picture of the stadium of the University of Utah, football stadium. I live here in Utah, and this is the stadium when it's full. At capacity, the stadium has about 47,825 people. If we assume that 75% of the participants are male, that translates to about 35,868 males would be sitting in an audience when the stadium is filled to capacity. Using the statistic of 1 in 6 male survivors, that translates to there's almost 6,000 male survivors in a football game at any given evening. And if we use a statistic of 1 in 4, there's almost 12,000. That's the human terms of what we're talking about with this issue today. Here's a graph that does a breakdown about how men describe being sexually assaulted or abused. What's interesting to notice about this is that when you ask men about their sexual trauma, probably about 22% of them respond that they participated in what would be called, quote, voluntary. Men do not take responsibility for their victimization, so a lot of them interpret their experience as having been voluntary. The other interesting part about this graph here is that 36% of sexual trauma for males involves some degree of force, intimidation, or threats. And the remaining 43% is covert seduction. And what that means is being engaged into asexual interaction under the guise of seduction, solicitation, whatever, which probably leaves a lot of males confused about whether it was voluntary or non-consenting. Unfortunately, sexual trauma can occur for any boy or any man at any age. Therefore, children are at risk as well as adults being at risk. The average age currently in our research indicates that the age of first abuse is about 10.1 years, so very young for which abuse may occur. I've had experience working with males as young as, with their sexual trauma as young as 6 months of age. It's not uncommon for people during early childhood and latency, but as children begin to approach adolescence, the frequency and the risk factor does increase. Sexual trauma is not specific to any particular racial or ethnic identity. It's not specific to any socioeconomic class. It cuts across all the lines. And the sexual trauma frequently occurs outside the immediate family system. As I was mentioning previously, it's not uncommon that within the systems that boys and men operate, sports events, youth groups, church camps, regular camps, that their abuse may occur in those settings. And the other thing that's becoming more available for our understanding is people who seem very successful, might be very prominent in whatever fields, can also have been victims of sexual trauma. There's numbers of public celebrities who've come out in recent years. Here's a book cover from R.A. Dickey, who was a pretty well-known baseball player a few years back, and he talks about his experience. And we've had a number of politicians or entertainers, movie stars, who have also come out and disclosed their history of sexual trauma. Unfortunately, it does cross all the lines within our culture. This graph is the breakdown of what we know at this point in time in terms of the gender of the offenders. It is still clear that most offending is perpetrated by males. And the same is the case here. Most male sexual trauma is received from a male offender. What's also important with this graph is that 28% of reports have female offenders. It's a very under-recognized, under-reported situation, but females can be offenders as well. And about 11% of male survivors report that they've had abuse from a male and or female over the course of their span. It's not uncommon for males that they will have had more than one offender, or that it may occur over a span of time with different intersections of offenders. So I mentioned in an earlier slide about covert abuse and emotional incest. What does that mean? Here's a slide that gives some information and definition of what we're talking about. And covert or emotional incest includes interactions that may begin or may be sustained under the umbrella or guise of caring. There's a fair number of males who report that their early abuse occurred under the pretense of personal hygiene from, say, a babysitter, from a parent, that began to be sexualized or that continued to be sexualized. An example here, too, would be an adolescent boy who a parent or a babysitter is still cleaning their genital areas, and in the process of doing that, being sexually stimulating of the male. And sexual harassment is a form of covert abuse. A lot of times we don't realize the entry point or the sustained abuse may occur under the guise of hazing, demeaning sexual jokes, bullying, etc. We get reports frequently of hazing activities in the military, in fraternities, in scouts or camps that are very highly sexualized, but they're under the umbrella of ritual or kind of the historical sense of, we've done this forever, this is just what we do in this club, and it's what you need to do to get entry. And more and more we're understanding, and males are reporting that they're really sexualized rituals, And for the people who are in the role of being recipients, it can sometimes be very traumatic and have long-lasting impact. Now, when it comes to males and their sexual trauma, we have a kind of a cultural norm of avoiding calling it what it is. It's important that in our language that we call sexual trauma what it is, and that is rape. And rape is any sexual victimization involving penetration or attempted penetration. It can involve mouth, penis, anus, the important point, without that person's consent. But sometimes I think our language, we underestimate when we call things just abuse, because it really is more clearly understood when we name it as it is, and that's rape. As I mentioned before, women as well as men can rape men. And for males, frequently there's the undercurrent or direct overtone of force, threat, manipulation. And for males, anal penetration is perhaps the most common form of rape when it's male to male. Now, part of the reason why our statistics have been changing over the course of time is we've never really had much clear reporting procedures. Rape recovery centers have anecdotally reported about males for years, but we've never had any official reporting through FBI or police channels. And that all changed in January of 2013. Up until that time, the definition of rape was the carnal knowledge of a female forcibly and against her will. Therefore, men couldn't be raped because rape was defined as a female event that happened. The new definition as of January is gender neutral, and the mention of male or female has been removed. You can see here the definition is determined by the incident, behavior, the act that happens, and not the gender, keeping the possibility of the wording of consent. What this has allowed us to do is, since January of 2013, we're now getting more accurate recording and reporting of the incidents of rape and sexual assault that is gender inclusive instead of limiting it to just females. That's going to allow us to bring more awareness to the breadth and depth and scope of this issue by now having more accurate information. So I encourage you just to take a second, and wherever you are, sitting, riding in your car, whatever, just take a second and reflect on what is your image of the typical victim of male sexual trauma. And I'm wondering what comes to mind for you, and want to challenge you to consider that probably some of your ideas of what male sexual trauma may be overshadowed by the myths that our culture carries about men being victims. There's a number of myths that we have. I just want to focus on a couple of them here for the length of this webinar presentation, but several things that are fundamental for us to figure out the truths that really will be more clearly defining than the myths. And the first one I want to touch on is and I'm going to address these by offering you the truth, and then I'll talk about the myth. The truth is that arousal and ejaculation are involuntary responses to sexual stimulation, and they do not mean that a boy or man wanted it. Male physiology can be stimulated sexually, whether there's violence, force, or non-consent involved. What we do, and the myth is that if you got an erection, if you ejaculated, it must have been consenting, or you must have wanted it. And two things happen with this myth. First of all, victims quickly internalize the sense that if I didn't want it, why did I respond? If I wasn't consenting, why did my body do what it did? So the fact that male genitalia is external leads boys to have the experience of as if their body betrayed them. There may have been force or violence, they didn't want it, but yet their body was responding in a sexual way that would just happen in other situations. It becomes very confusing. And the offenders and sometimes other people will perpetuate this as well, saying, If you didn't want it, why did you get erect? If you didn't want it, why did you ejaculate? And offenders will expertly use that to try to intimidate, to continue the sexual interaction. But it's really important that we understand that sexual response can occur under trauma as well as within routinely intimate and loving relationships. But this is a huge myth that prevents, stalls, creates barriers for males dealing with their sexual trauma. Now, equally important, current research demonstrates no statistically significant link between being sexually abused and becoming a sexual offender. However, our cultural myth is that if males are sexually assaulted, there's a high risk factor that they'll become offenders as well. We've carried that myth for a long time, and it persists to this day. While historically the research has been true that most sexual offenders do have a history of sexual trauma, we have kind of stopped in our understanding there. The reverse does not apply. We do not have statistical evidence to show that most men or boys will become sexual offenders. Quite the opposite. Many boys and men who have been sexually traumatized become huge advocates for sexual protection, sexual prevention, and are strongly in the field. But because we carry this myth, a lot of times people get nervous, don't feel safe around. They're learning the knowledge that some male in their life has been sexually traumatized. Third is that sexual orientation is not determined by sexual trauma. We still carry the myth that being gay, bisexual, anything other than heterosexual is a virus that you can catch, or that certain things will make you gay. And what we need to realize is that being gay is not transmittable, and sexual trauma does not make someone gay. It's a deeply held myth. And whereas the abuse may have been male on male, that's heterosexual behavior, but it's not about sexual orientation, and it does not make someone that way. As I mentioned before, women can be perpetrators as well. About 14% of sexual abuse against boys is reported to have a female as the offender. And we need to be aware that boys and men can be trafficked, just like our understanding of girls and women. I just refer you here. You may want to record and write down this web link, very powerful, about a man who was sex trafficked from a very young age, and talks about his story, and has become incredibly successful in his current life, and is exposing this issue of male sexual trafficking. UNICEF estimates about 24,000 boys a year are caught as victims of sex trafficking. So the point, if you are a provider in whatever field, really take time to understand the facts, because we're all influenced by the myths, and we need to be interacting with our male survivors in ways that don't perpetuate the myths but support the facts. Now, I want to just mention briefly, I'm not going to go into this real in depth because it's for a longer, more extensive clinical training, but three aspects, three principles of clinical work that may be helpful just to know. I encourage all of you to approach the issue of sexuality and gender as a spectrum and not binary. I think when we have the rigidity of gay, straight, male, female, masculine, feminine, we lose sight of the fluidity and spectrum of human sexuality and gender. Spectrum is going to be much more helpful in working with people around the impact of the trauma on their identities, both sexual and gender. But if we're in the trying to push people towards they have to pick sides, pick teams, be one or the other, clinical training will be more complicated, more difficult. So a chapter I've written in a book that was mentioned in the opening slide, I just addressed this in more detail. I encourage you to refer to that and give you a more extensive, in-depth understanding of this issue. The second thing is to give consideration that sexual trauma will impact victims differently depending upon the stage of their development, especially when it's about identity. And for example, sexual trauma when you don't have a clue of your sexuality, sexual identity is very different than sexual trauma that happens when you're in the middle of confusion about who you are as a sexual being, which is still very different if it happens after you've reached clarity about your sexual and gender identity. So we don't often ask about those issues of sexual development and how that intersects with the sexual trauma, but I encourage you, that's an important consideration. And then lastly, is sometimes there's a dual layering of sexual trauma within the context of sexual minority distress. If you're dealing with individuals who are not 100% conforming around masculinity, not 100% within their definition of heterosexuality, there's likely to be some level of sexual minority distress. That's a word you may want to look up and learn more understanding, but it's something that's very powerful influence. When that intersects with sexual trauma, sometimes you may not know which of these is the point that's under discussion while you're interacting with the client, because it could be the trauma and it could be the minority distress, but you need to have an alertness to both of those and how they intersect. Briefly, I'm going to include here some slides that give some general clues about dynamics, because so often men do not come to therapy clearly identifying, I am a sexual trauma survivor. Probably they'll come into therapy for other reasons, and it's helpful to know here's a kind of a constellation of emotional feelings that may be presenting, and it's usually not any single one of these that's going to be your clue that someone's a survivor, but be aware that these constellations, the more they begin to stack up, may alert you to ask more about their trauma, or what may be even more helpful is ask all your clients about sexual trauma, and you may notice that some of these feelings are present for those clients. And here's a list of some behaviors, external behaviors that may be indicators. With males, what's particularly important to realize is males have a lot of permission to engage in risky behavior. So therefore, a lot of self-destructive behaviors may be under the frame of risky behaviors. For example, engaging in risky sports is something I found a lot of times males begin to seek out being hurt or getting injuries. It's just a different way than cutting or banging your head or doing something else. It kind of is more disguised social permission, driving fast, drinking too much. Some of those can frequently be clues about someone who's really in a very self-destructive response pattern from their trauma. What we see it as, well, that's just men being men, boys being boys, and we need to be more alert to some of those behaviors as indicators. Some lasting effects. Male survivors frequently internalize responsibility. We have a belief that as a male, you should be able to protect yourself no matter what your age, no matter what your circumstances. And males have a hard time realizing that sometimes they were powerless, sometimes they were overpowered. And too often, allies, caregivers, family members, even professionals may scrutinize males to identify what was their blame and what happened with their victimization. So we can't make sense of how a male might have had that experience, so we might be drawn more quickly to blaming them for their victimization. A couple other things here to be aware of. Men frequently numb their emotions. What's difficult is that that's a cultural norm of masculinity frequently, so we don't know when they're just being men and when they're numbing because they're trying to deal with their trauma. It's very frequent that men who have been sexually traumatized have the resulting confusion about their sexual identity, sexual orientation, and lots of difficulty with sexual functioning and intimacy. Interpersonal problems. One that surprises people a lot of times, and just to be alerted if you're working over any extended period of time with male trauma survivors, is the fear of success. And how many males are afraid or have anxiety about being a parent. They're afraid of being physically close, physically nurturing and in contact. And this frequently for the men is related to the myth that we talked about before, that if you're interacting too much with a boy, people might see that as you're moving into offending behavior. So a lot of men, through my experience, back out of their parenting and become more aloof, more distant, maybe work longer hours, partly as a self-protection, because they don't want to get caught in that trap of their fears of being accused of being an offender if they're too engaged or involved with their children. Even if men do seek therapy, as I mentioned, frequently they do not come to therapy for sexual trauma. They may be referred by someone else. So you might want to make it part of the routine to just ask about this is people's history for all clients. Unfortunately, here's a picture that represents the effect of denial and minimization, frequent representation of how men approach their trauma. Now, if you're not familiar with the ACEs study, I encourage you to do so. It's a study that was done by the CDC over a period of time, had a large sample. Unfortunately, most of the sample was whites. It's a sample in San Diego. But the important part is that that study found a rate of 16% of males who had at least one adverse childhood experience. And the way the study goes is the more adverse childhood experiences you had, the more impact there was going to be on other aspects of your life. As I mentioned, the study was done primarily on white population. More recently, someone has replicated that study and has included more racial and ethnic minorities, has gotten some different results. This will give you some information here about the translation across new racial lines. But the important part of the expanded ACE study to notice here is the frequency that people living in oppressive environments, inner cities, being minorities, how issues of racism, unsafe neighborhoods, bullying, witnessing violence become ACEs that were not included in the original study. And they're very, very powerful, and they have very huge impacts on people. So I encourage you to explore these with clients that come in. The importance is that there's a direct link that's being identified between increased exposure to ACEs and increased medical risks. Here's some of the kind of medical issues that frequently are hard to diagnose or hard to work on finding treatment protocols that are oftentimes related to early trauma. And here's behavioral issues that are frequently related to especially early ACEs. Males don't step forward frequently and talk about their abuse. The same thing I talked about before with the myths, that the issues of stereotypes of masculinity, fears of homophobia, the myths we talked about, a lot of times men just decide to deal with it by themselves on their own. And in the weekend retreat programs that I've conducted for about 17 or 18 years now, we've done anecdotal studies of our men who've come to those weekends. And interestingly enough, the average length of time that men report between the time of their trauma and the reporting the trauma is about 20 years. A pretty startling statistic. And here's a list of some things that males may come to therapy for that should be identified as concerns to ask more about sexual trauma. And we need not overlook the fact that sexual trauma is a huge issue in the military. The military is doing a great job of beginning to take on this issue, identify it, and try to treat it. Within the military context, it's really identified as male sexual trauma. And what's important to understand within military settings is your unit is frequently like family. So a lot of the abuse that may happen in the military has the overtones of incest, of institutional betrayal, because it is like your family unit. So what I encourage you, if you're in a provider setting where you work with men, ask the same questions that you would ask of all clients, of females as well, and practice gender neutrality in the kind of questions that you ask. I want to mention just really briefly some things that will be helpful to know about pathways to healing. Even if you're not involved in longer term care, it's helpful to know some things about this because you can incorporate it even if you're a first responder, if you have brief interactions. The main thing to realize in working with sexual trauma is that safety always comes first, and that it's important to really engage your clients in what they need to be safe. So in your languaging, rather than talking about what you're doing to make your client safe, talk and engage the client. What do they need to be safe enough to share openly, to tell you what they need to say? And you'll notice a lot of times that safety can be represented by somatic or external body cues. The summary of this list is basically to pay attention to the way in which people smallify when they have been traumatized. You begin to move towards invisibility, to physically shrinking, to doing that kind of safety and protection response. But if you are aware of that, you'll begin to see clients do those behaviors, and it should be a cue for you that there may be some degree of unsafety happening. And what you really want to do is being able to move people towards more degrees of bigifying or being more safe. And be aware of the access for risk-taking behaviors, like I mentioned before. For men, that's hard because there's so much more permission to engage in risky behaviors that may have self-injury. Even drinking and addictions for males sometimes can be easily excused. And once you have addressed or dealt with the experience of internal safety, then there also needs to be attention given to external safety. We need to encourage clients who have experienced trauma not to blindly trust, to learn the skills of when and how to trust. And the trust needs to be earned. We need to be alert to our environment, as well as just assuming that things are safe. And safe enough is always important. Sometimes in our work we may tell clients, now you're safe, now things will be okay. And it's really important that we realize that there are no guarantees for safety. We need to teach people the skills of how to protect themselves and be safe. And the reality is that we do still live in places where there is systemic oppression and cultural bias. And that may greatly contribute to the intersection, as I talked about before, of these other issues with sexual trauma. Briefly about memory, a couple of things to say, because this comes up so often as people tell their narrative, tell their story. Memory is not linear. And so therefore, if we can find approaches or possibilities where people can tell their story as they have recall, and it's like putting a puzzle together, being able to do it piece by piece as you remember, rather than you should be able to tell it all at one time. Too often people come in and tell their story, and then later it changes, and later it changes, and later it changes. And then we hold them accountable that they must not be telling the truth, rather than realizing that the nonlinear fashion of memory may mean that some things get altered, and that some parts of memory may be subjective, because so often when we're having experiences under huge stress or duress, we may view them with what's our experience rather than what's factually accurate. And if any of you are doing therapeutic work, subjective experience is just as important as factual. Dissociation, what I would just mention here is that dissociation is not just a fear response. It's a normal human response under the stressor of the trauma that you're experiencing. Memory work guidelines, it's important, key here, the main thing I'll mention in the brief time we have here is that remembering and revisiting should not be reliving. We should not have the goal with our clients that when they're telling their stories, when they're sharing their information, that they're reliving. We need to be sure that they have enough grounding, enough safety, that they can be telling their memories from the here and now, not going back to be in the memories. And it's not important that people remember everything. People need to remember what is creating distress, what is unstable in terms of their recall and experience. But there's probably no client that ever remembers every detail. And so as providers, we need to be clear about giving permission to remember what you need to remember, not to have this magical goal of a finish line with the memories. It's important that women be available to work with male survivors. Ideally, if you're in an agency setting, what would be the best practice possible is when clients come in to ask them, would you like to work with a male or female? Many agencies don't have that possibility or that freedom. But whenever possible, if we can ask people, do you have a choice? I found in my experience at different points in their process, some men would prefer to work with a female. At other points, they would prefer to work with a male. So it's ideal when they can have that choice. The relationship that a sexual trauma survivor may have to male or female can be very subjective, depending on what their trauma was. So it's going to be a great stride towards safety if it's possible to involve them in some degree of choosing themselves. And we need to factor in issues of culture. As I mentioned, the minority stress that happens. There are so many factors of trauma by being of any minority status. And there's going to be constant intersections with sexual trauma for people who are diverse. And how sexuality, sexual trauma, gender identity sometimes is dealt with differently within different arenas of cultural background, religious background, etc. So we need to understand one size doesn't fit all, and we need to be sensitive to the cultural setting in which someone has been identified and where they may perhaps still be identified. Transgender survivors, we need to remember transgender individuals are at high risk for experiencing sexual trauma. What I encourage is helpful is if you're in gender-specific settings, anyone who identifies as male should have access to your setting. If you're in female-identified gender settings, anyone who identifies as female should be allowed access in those settings. I don't think people should have to go through lots of hoops or criteria in terms of their identity as transgender. Whichever gender they're identifying should be the place where they're allowed to do their work. And we need to realize that as individuals are dealing with their transgender identity, as they're living as transgenders, they're at high risk for being targeted for sexual trauma, bullying, etc. That's still a big issue in our culture. In conclusion, I want to mention again that I do do weekend, 3-day weekend retreats for male survivors. We're going to be adding into our protocol more frequent days of recovery, single-day events. We do them all over the country. And here's our website link to find us and find out information about the program. We do several level ones a year, usually do at least one advanced a year. And part of the point for mentioning this is that so much healing can be experienced when men are with other men and when they're in group settings and they have the sense of community. The weekend retreats allow that opportunity. The days of recovery offer that opportunity of being with other survivors. If you have groups in your community, I encourage you to consider that as an adjunct resource to supplement any individual work you're doing. And finally, a couple of resources for you to check into. Here again is our web link for our Weekends of Recovery for Male Survivors. 2 other prominent organizations at the national level that have programs, resources on their websites, oneinsix.org and rain.org. And you can also, through those organizations, have access to communication boards, chat rooms, etc. Thank you for your time and your attention, and I appreciate your interest in this topic, and whatever work setting you have contact with male survivors, thank you for your work and your dedication. And if you have the opportunity, I hope you can come to a longer training, seek out other programs. The men you work with will be well served by whatever additional training and resources you can get. Thank you.